Welcome to the Damascus Road podcast. On the road to Damascus, Paul had a radical encounter with Jesus and his life was changed forever. That is what we hope and pray for here. Now, on to this week's episode.
So how do you think you would do in the desert? Did you need those survival tips from Bear Grylls in order to make it through? Now, obviously, we all managed to live just fine in the desert. As we are now into week 3 of our series, Holy Places, this is the one that we're all the most familiar with easily. This isn't like oceans where we have to drive 4 hours at minimum to get to an ocean. This isn't like mountains where, we can see mountains, they're all around us, but you still got to drive an hour or so to get to those. No. Unlike those holy places, we don't have to go anywhere to get to a desert. We live there. Now, I have lived in Tucson year-round since I graduated from the U of A in 2013. So that's 10 years and 10 summers in the desert. Yeah, I guess I'm getting a little old now. But from my time in the desert, from spending hundreds of days sitting outside on the U of A mall at the water table, from going on hikes in the Tucson desert and in the sun, to just kind of getting ready to just depart the safety and security of the air-conditioned home to just go to Costco. I've have my own set of some desert survival tips. Okay, tip number 1, put on sunscreen. Just do it. Are you worried about wanting to get a nice tan? Well, forget it. You're not going to look nice and tan like a wonderful Costco rotisserie chicken. You're going to look like a tomato and just be beet red. Let's be honest. That's not how this works in this desert. And also skin cancer, that's something to worry about. So wear sunscreen and don't forget to reapply it. Tip number 2, get a hat and some sunglasses. I had this one first. Bear Grylls stole that one from me. Now maybe on that, you're like me, and the hair on the top of your head is just not quite as thick as it used to be. So then I encourage you to wear a hat before you have to experience the pain of a sunburned scalp. And also that desert sun is bright, so don't forget your sunglasses. I have accumulated a stockpile of free sunglasses. So many people are just giving them away on campus. So if you're a student and you're up for talking to every credit union or apartment complex or just those people that are trying to recruit college students to sell knives for some reason, if you just go talk to those people, you can probably get all this free sunglasses that you need and that will last you for years or at least a year, depending on how quickly you lose them. Okay, tip number 3, don't drink your pee. Just buy a good water bottle and take it with you everywhere. And then stop by our water table and refill it frequently. That's why we're out there. Refreshing. And that's it. That's how I survive August days, sitting outside in the heat, trying to meet new people on campus and invite them to church or board game nights or trivia nights, whatever event, whatever thing we got going on. But I know I am preaching to the choir. We all have our metal, vacuum-sealed water bottles filled to the top with ice-cold water. I see dozens of them out there. We're good. We got our sunscreen, and we know to reapply it every few hours. And on our way out of the house, we grab our hats, we grab our sunglasses. I know it. We're good. And most of all, we know the key survival tip to getting through the Tucson desert. And that's just to stay inside and never leave the air conditioning, right? So thank you. Thank you, Bear Grylls, for all of your advice on when exactly is the right time to drink our pee. But we know how to prepare for the desert. We're good. We can survive living in the desert. I think we have proven that. But that kind of also says something right about deserts. They're not nice places, aren't they? Deserts are something to survive or even escape if possible. Deserts are dry places. They're places of scarcity. There's not enough food. There's not enough water. We just want to get through them as quickly as possible. And we experience dry places in our lives as well. These are places where we are experiencing scarcity, where there's a lack of what we think we need or want or desire. And we can go through dry places of relationship, where we find ourselves feeling alone and we just want to find someone to commit to and live our lives with. We can go through dry places of purpose, where we feel like we're just stuck in a meaningless phase of life. And we just want to get through this job, or we just want to get through this degree. We want to get through college. We want to get onto something that has real meaning. Or we can get lost into dry places of security, and when we're suddenly unemployed, or when we have long been underemployed, and we're just trying to get by. We're trying to survive until whatever comes next. There are many, many more dry places that we find ourselves lost in throughout our lives. These are all marked by scarcity, by the lack of something that we think we need to survive or to flourish in this life. They are unpleasant, they are frustrating, and sometimes they're just boring. Like a desert, these dry places are barren, desolate, and they seem to just simply go on forever. Dry places are this uncomfortable in-between. We've left one place behind. Maybe that was a good place, maybe it was a bad place. But we've not yet arrived at whatever it is that comes next. They seem endless. They seem like they can go on forever. And we just want to get through to whatever comes next. We just want to get to where we think we expect to find more, where we can find abundance, out of the desert and into the land flowing with milk and honey. And the Bible is full of dry places, both metaphorical and literal. Moses is lost in a desert. The Israelites wander in the desert. Jesus is tempted by Satan in the desert. The biblical story just keeps going back to the desert. Time and time again, God's chosen people find themselves in these dry places, and they don't get through them quickly. Instead, they spend weeks, they spend years, or even decades wandering through dry places. But we can find something unexpected in these stories, because these are not merely stories of survival or of getting through the desert. These are stories of God preparing God's people as God leads them into the desert, meets them, cares for them, and in the desert, God forms their identities. In these dry places, God prepares them. And what if God intends to use these dry places to prepare us as well? What if this dry place that we are in is not an accident? What if it's not something just to survive, something to escape from, but is instead a place to dwell in and to sit with God as God forms us into who we are made to be? So let us sit with that question this morning. Let's ponder that. Let's consider whether that could be true. We have sailed into the deep places where God calls us. We've climbed the high places with God, where God meets us. Now let us stop and sit in the dry places. Let's dwell in the desert with some biblical desert dwellers and ask if this really can be the place where God forms our identities and prepares us for the good things that God planned for us so long ago. One of the most famous Bible characters is also its most prolific desert dweller, Moses. Born to Hebrew slaves, but raised in the palace by Pharaoh's daughter, Moses grew up in Egypt, split between these two identities of prince and pauper, of Hebrew and Egyptian. And this tension between his dual identities came to a head in an event that we can read about in Exodus 2. Many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. After looking in all directions to make sure that no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. The next day, when Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw two Hebrew men fighting. "Why are you beating up your friend?" Moses said to the one who had started the fight. Well, that man replied, "Who appointed you to be our prince and our judge? Are you going to kill me just like you killed that Egyptian yesterday?" Then Moses was afraid, thinking, "Everyone knows what I did." And sure enough, Pharaoh heard what had happened. He heard what Moses had done, and he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. Moses knows he's a Hebrew. He's trying to identify with the other Hebrews, and he goes out to visit them one day. But apparently he's not very aware of these awful conditions that they're living under, because he is shocked and horrified. And in that, he acts impulsively. He kills the Egyptian, seemingly forgetting that as an Egyptian royal, he probably had authority and other power to have done literally anything else that could have helped the Hebrews without murdering a man. He's torn between these identities, and he finds himself without really any identity. The Hebrews certainly don't see him as one of them, and after his moment of forgetting his Egyptian identity, they're rid of him as well. So Moses flees into the desert and to the land of Midian. Now, Moses' story is retold in Acts, and thanks to Acts, we learn a bit more of his situation. Acts is in the New Testament, so Acts was written in Greek originally. And the Greek word that Acts uses to describe this place of Moses' exile is eremos. And eremos has a lot of possible definitions. Desert, deserted place, desolate place, solitary place, lonely place, quiet place, and wilderness. Sometimes in English we will read wilderness or solitary place or desert, but it is all the eremos. And I want us to pay attention to that because it'll help us to recognize that there are more stories that are connected by this eremos than we may realize. Exodus does not tell us that Moses is in a desert, but from Acts we know that it is eremos, and we know that Midian is dry and arid. This is another eremos. If you're familiar with the story, then you know what comes next. Moses encounters God in a burning bush in Exodus chapter 3. So we read, "One day Moses was tending to the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock far into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of the bush, and Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up. 'This is amazing,' Moses said to himself. 'Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go see it.'" And this iconic encounter with God sets the stage for the rest of this epic Exodus story. From the burning bush, Moses is sent to liberate the Hebrew slaves and lead them from Egypt to the promised land. There he will bring plagues down upon the Egyptians. Moses will part the Red Sea. He will receive the law from God, the terms of the covenant between God and God's people that will shape the identity of these people for millennia. But sandwiched in between Exodus chapter 2 and Exodus chapter 3 is something critical, something that doesn't make it into those high points of the story. But it's the only reason that this burning bush is able to happen in the first place. From the book of Acts, we also learn that Moses was 40 years old when he fled into the desert and that he was 80 years old when he encountered the burning bush. This means he spent 40 years dwelling in the desert. That's 40 years between fleeing Egypt and finding God in a flaming shrub. What an incredibly long time. What's the longest that you've ever dwelt in a dry place yourself in the past? Based on a quick scan of the room, many of us are not old enough to have spent 40 years anywhere. But Moses spends 40 long years in the desert, in between his past in Egypt and the great purpose that we know is in store for him. In this time, God is preparing Moses. In Exodus 2, Moses is impulsive and reactive. He acts quickly and he murders the Egyptian without thinking. In Exodus 3, Moses comes through the desert to Sinai, the mountain of God, and he sees the bush that is burning with fire but that is not being consumed. Consider how long would it take for that fire to consume the bush. It would take some time for the fire to consume the bush and some time to notice that it wasn't. In the middle of the desert, Moses had to stop and he had to watch the burning bush to realize something amazing was happening. What patience to be able to stop and to slow down and to notice something so spectacular. Furthermore, in Exodus 2, Moses is rejected by the Hebrew man that he tried to help, who asks him, "Well, who appointed you to be our prince and judge?" And then 40 years in the desert later, God declares to Moses, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people out of Egypt." If Moses were to run into that man who challenged him with if Moses were to run back into that man, the man who said, "Well, who made you the boss of us?" Well, Moses can now say, "Yahweh, the God of our fathers, put me in charge." From reactive to patient, from rejected by the people to chosen by God, Moses' identity is formed in the desert. He is prepared by God for a holy mission in the Ramos, over many, many years of waiting and dwelling in the silent, unglamorous, glossed-over dry place. However, Moses' time in the desert does not end here, because after God liberates the Hebrews from slavery in Egypt and claims them as the people of Israel, Moses leads the Israelites to the land that God had promised them, and it is wonderful. It is described as a land flowing with milk and honey. It is everything we hope for after wandering through a dry place, but it's also full of people. And God's people are scared of those people. Surely these people will wipe them out when they try to take the promised land. And they lament, if only we had died in Egypt or even here in the wilderness. They are not ready to move forward, so God gives them what they want. God declares that they will not enter the land, but instead you must wander the wilderness for 40 years. Yes, another 40 years of dwelling in the desert for Moses. But this time he will be joined by the whiny, demanding Israelites. Obviously, no one's pumped about this idea of wandering in the desert for like another 40 years. So the Israelites turn about face, and suddenly they decide, no, actually we are ready. We're ready to enter the promised land. Just kidding. And they declare, let's go. They said, we realize that we have sinned, but now we are ready to enter the promised land that the Lord has promised us. But Moses said, why are you now disobeying the Lord's orders to return to the wilderness? It won't work. Do not go up into the land now. You will only be crushed by your enemies because the Lord is not with you. When you face the Amalekites and the Canaanites in battle, you will be slaughtered. The Lord will abandon you because you have abandoned the Lord. Moses knows this is a bad idea. He knows God will not be with them now as they try to take the promised land because they are not ready to move forward. Not only did Moses need a new identity, the Israelites needed new ones as well after living as slaves to the Egyptians for generations. After all of that trauma that they have suffered as a people, they need time in the dry place before they are ready to move forward. So God sends them back into the desert, into the Eremos, because they need to dwell in the desert. And the next 40 years for the Israelites are not easy, but they are vital. In the desert, they struggle with scarcity again and again. There's not enough food in the desert. There's not enough water in the dry place. There's simply not enough in the Eremos. At least there wasn't enough for them to get through it on their own. For when there wasn't enough food, God sends manna, a miraculous food from heaven that sustains them. When there's not enough water, God instructs Moses on how to release water from a rock. When enemies try to take advantage of their weakness and attack them, God gives them enough strength to win their battles. Time and time again, when faced with scarcity in the desert, God provides enough. All of this time, God used the scarcity of the desert to remind the Israelites to slow down, to wait, to depend on God. And God was preparing them for a time when they will leave the dry place, when there will be enough. And before they finally enter into the promised land, 40 years and a generation later, in his final message to them, Moses warns them, do not forget your time in the desert. But that is the time to be careful. Beware that in your plenty, you do not forget the Lord your God and disobey his commands, his regulations, and decrees that I'm giving to you today. For when you have become full and prosperous, and when you have built fine homes to live in, when your flocks and herds have become very large, and your silver and gold have multiplied along with everything else, be careful. Do not become proud at that time and forget the Lord your God, who rescued you from slavery in the land of Egypt. Do not forget that he led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its poisonous snakes and scorpions where it was so hot and dry. He gave you water from the rock. He fed you with manna in the wilderness, a food unknown with your ancestors. He did this to humble you and to test you for your own good. He did all of this so that you would never say to yourself, I have achieved this wealth with my own strength and energy. Remember the Lord your God. He is the one who gives you power to be successful, in order to fulfill the covenant he confirmed with your ancestors with an oath. Moses is pretty much turning to the Israelites and saying, hey, here are my survival tips for you in the land of plenty. Moses is more worried about their flourishing, their success, their ability to survive, not in the desert, but now in this place where there will be enough. Do not forget. That is his tip. Do not forget. Remember the dry place. Remember the desert. Moses isn't worried about when to drink pee. Moses is worried about when to remember, to not forget. You may be in a dry place now, but don't be in a rush to get through. Meet God in it now. In its scarcity, see God's provision. And when you get through it, remember how God met you there. Remember that tip from Moses, how to survive in the land of plenty. Because in the desert, scarcity reminds us to slow down, to wait, and depend on God. Remember. Moses spent 40 years in the desert before God called him from the burning bush. Then he spent another 40 years wandering with impatient, disobedient Israelites. And all of this time was important time as God was forming them and meeting them there. 40 years may seem excessive, but it's important to understand desert time is not wasted time. God is not wasteful. Although those 40 years may seem like a lot, that was the time it took for God to form their identity and as God's people. It was that time it took for them to respond to God, to prepare for the promised land. And our desert time is not wasted time either. The time we spend in dry places is the time that God is using to shape us, to grow us, to prepare us for the good works that God has planned for us. But our time in the desert of the Bible and these Bible stories, it does not end here with entering the promised land. You may have caught on from the last couple of weeks that these places of significance, that these sites of meaning from those chaotic waters to the divine mountaintops are places where Jesus goes to. Jesus walks out onto the waves and calms the storm. Jesus leads his disciples up to the mountain, and then he meets them in the valleys as well. And Jesus also, he too wanders in the wilderness. He too dwells in the desert. But in the desert, Jesus is not alone. In Matthew 4, we read, "Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. For 40 days and 40 nights he fasted and became very hungry." Jesus is led into the wilderness, or again, into the eremos, where he spends 40 days fasting and hungering. Now, why should Jesus need this time in the desert? He's not like Moses. He's not fleeing from sin, or he's not like the Israelites who were fearful and still not able to trust God. Unlike Moses and the Israelites, Jesus knows who he is, right? Yet there in the desert, he is met by the devil who targets his identity directly. "If you are the Son of God," the devil repeats to Jesus again and again. If that is true, if that is who you are. And each time, Jesus responds to the devil with the truth of Scripture. Each time, Jesus reasserts his true identity as the Son of God. It's easy to read this passage and think that Jesus is at his weakest. He has been fasting for 40 days. He's been in the desert for 40 days. He must be physically weak and exhausted, right? It is a testament to his divinity that he resists the devil. But what if that's not the case? What if it's not the case that this is actually Jesus at his weakest? Because if God used the desert to form Moses, if God used the desert to prepare the Israelites, then maybe the desert isn't a place of weakness. Maybe the desert is a place of strength. Being in the desert usually seems like a curse, but the Bible reframes that narrative. God intentionally sends us into the desert to form us and prepare us for the good works that God has planned for us. Our identity is tested in the desert as the desert strips away the false props of ourselves. It leaves us only with only who we are before God and in God. There is not enough except with God. As in the desert, scarcity reminds us to slow down, wait, and depend on God. When we picture monks, we picture them in their brown habits, living and working around like a simple pastoral monastery. But the Christian monastic tradition began back in the Egyptian desert. It began with the desert fathers who fled civilization, who fled abundance for the dry place of not enough, where life took discipline and intentionality, where scarcity led to trust. They fled the dangers of enough for the refuge of the desert. They were imitating Jesus, who battled the devil in the desert because they believe the desert is where we do battle with the father of lies. They're picking the home turf. They're picking where they want to have this battle. They picked the desert. For the desert fathers, they recognized that value of the desert as a place of trial to battle our inner and outer demons. The monastic desert was a frontier territory, sort of spiritual liminal place between the everyday and the spiritual world. And for the desert fathers, the in-between nature of dry places was not something to frustrate them, but instead something of significance for their inner lives with God. If you came to Momentum last fall, you heard us talk about Evagrius Ponticus, a desert father from the 4th century who wrote Talking Back, a monastic handbook for combating demons, a complex and thoughtful work on how we fight back against the devil through focusing our thoughts and our minds on God, allowing God to fill our lives with truth. He understood a simple truth about the desert. When it's barren, all you can think about is the one who creates life. So it seems that Jesus was not at his weakest in the desert, but that in the midst of the dry place, that is where Jesus was closest to God and most secure in his identity as the Son of God. In fact, we see Jesus return to the desert again and again throughout his ministry. Remember what I said before about the Greek word eremos and the different definitions and the translations that we can find for it in our English Bible. Desert, deserted place, desolate place, solitary place, lonely place, quiet place, wilderness. Those are all ways the translators make sense of that word for us today. The 40 days Jesus spends in the desert being tempted by the devil is in the eremos, just like for Moses and for the Israelites with their 40 years in the eremos. For Jesus, the eremos is not only a desert, it's a solitary place. It is a place where Jesus can be with God and can be strengthened by God's presence. Where else does Jesus go to the eremos? When Jesus goes to lonely places to pray, that's eremos. When Jesus withdraws to the desolate place to rest, that's eremos. Over and over, Jesus returns to the eremos, to the lonely place, to the quiet place, as a habit and as a practice that grounds him and centers him. Both Moses and the Israelites also encountered God in dry and desolate places in the eremos. What's different between their lives and Jesus is that Jesus is so incredibly intentional about not just happening upon an eremos, but about structuring his life around having a dedicated eremos space. Rather than fleeing from the desert, Jesus retreats to the desert. Just as we see how God uses the desert to prepare and to form the identities of Moses and the Israelites, we too can reorient our relationship with the dry places in our lives and recognize them as a place for our own formation. We can learn from Jesus' practice, and we can intentionally return to the eremos, to the desert, to the dry places. First, recognize the desert you are in. Our deserts feel like places of scarcity. They're places where we feel as if there is not enough. They are the in-between places where we are anxious to pass through and onto whatever it is that comes next. They're the unglamorous chapters between Exodus 2 and Exodus 3, the 40 years of quiet, patient silence. It's where we are called to be with God and to be formed into the way of Jesus. And we may even need to choose the desert for our own growth and ability to center on God. We don't have to rush through the desert to the next promotion, the next job, the next adventure, the next relationship, whatever the next thing is. But if if we don't take the time to look internally and to let God shape us in the desert, we then won't get the most out of those good things. We won't remember and enjoy those good things that we've been looking forward to. Second, consider how you can intentionally return to the desert. Jesus repeatedly went into the eremos. What would it mean to intentionally enter into a dry place? For example, what would intentional singleness look like? Now, I'm not encouraging anyone here to break up with your girlfriend or to divorce your husband so as to enter into this desert of singleness. But what if you find yourself rushing from relationship to relationship, constantly feeling dissatisfied? Or what if you have found yourself dwelling in this desert, feeling barren and alone? I invite you, instead of trying to rush out of your dry place, to instead sit in it and dwell in it. Make it intentional. Commit to a season of singleness. Let it be a place of formation as you wait. I mean, sometimes really there's not much you can do about the scarcity of people to date in your life, so you might as well just make it part of the plan. Or what if you were to intentionally wait for children and enter that dry place for yourself? I know my parents, after my older sister and my older brother were born, they still wanted another child. They did not mean to wait like the 6 years that it was between my brother and me, but no child came when they tried and when they planned sooner. That was a dry place for them. But it was one where God did important work in forming their marriage and my family. The scarcity left room for my dad to be vulnerable and to tell my mom honestly that he could handle coming fourth, but he couldn't handle coming fifth. And that space allowed my mom to hear that and to reorient her identities as a wife and as a mother, and to reprioritize my dad and their marriage and their life. Together, they committed to being in a dry place. They never knew if their family would grow again, and they would be content with whatever they had. And that would have been okay. Now, obviously, I came along just a few years later, just a little more, a little bit longer of a dry place than they expected, but I think that also highlights something important about dry places that I want to remind us about too. We don't control our dry places. And even accepting those dry places doesn't really guarantee that we're going to get through them, or at least not get through them in the way we expect. But with God, we can come to a new understanding of enough, even among scarcity. We can find manna in the desert and peace like Jesus. For in the desert, scarcity reminds us to slow down, to wait, and to depend on God. And third, although the desert is a place where God prepares us, you can also prepare for the desert. I invite everyone to engage in desert practices. These are practices of self-denial, practices of abstinence, and intentional scarcity. Silence and solitude, for example, those are a desert practice. Fasting is another. And I want to focus on that one, fasting. Because for the last few weeks, we have been fasting together as a community each Wednesday. And we've started small, just like one day from like 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. And although some of you may have felt ambitious and gone for something longer than that, but now as a community, I want to encourage us to take that next step together. You see, it just so happens that this Wednesday is the very first day of Lent. Lent is a season of preparation before we get to Easter, which is the day that we celebrate, that day that we remember Jesus' resurrection and the new life that we receive through him. We remember, just as Moses encouraged the Israelites to do upon entering the promised land, to remember the desert. And Lent, just so happens to be, Lent is 40 days long. Just draw your attention to that fact. We've had 40 years, periods of 40 years. We've had periods of 40 days. This is very intentional. This is the Bible telling us to pay attention, to recognize that these are connected. These are stories of preparation, of waiting on God. So Lent is another 40-day story that we can enter into. This intentionally roots us into Jesus' 40 days of fasting in the desert. It roots us into Moses and the Israelites' 40 long years in the wilderness. So as part of the preparation, it is a common practice to give something up for those 40 days of Lent. For example, I know people who give up sugar in all forms. Now, that is a good practice, but that's not exactly what I'm challenging us to do here. I want to encourage us all to take that step beyond simply abstaining from something. And instead, I want us to enter into a desert ourselves. By fasting, we will train ourselves to rely on God, to deny ourselves in favor of the identities that God gives us, because when it is barren, all you can think of is the one who creates life. Fasting also reminds us that our bodies and our souls are interconnected as a physical practice with deep spiritual impact. So let us choose to fast, as Jesus did in the desert. So for the next 40 days, we will fast together as a community. Now, to be clear, you do not have to do this fast. We're not going to check in on you and kick out someone who eats on a Wednesday. Not the deal. But I do want to encourage us. We really want to encourage everyone who considers this their community, who's a part of our church family here, to take part in this. We feel very strongly that fasting is a part of the way of Jesus, and that if we can do it together, we can encourage one another, we can grow in our identities as children of God and as brothers and sisters in Christ, just as Jesus did in his desert dwelling. So the plan is we will fast 2 days a week, Wednesday and Friday, from sundown to sundown. This means that you have dinner as normal the day before, and then you fast until dinner on Wednesday or Friday. And fasting means not eating and using that time to pray instead. Now I understand there's a number of health reasons, or like eating disorders, or we have nursing moms who not eating for a full day would be a concern, and that's fair. I want to create space for that, and one of the recommendations is instead perhaps you can try a Daniel fast instead, where you still eat, you just focus what you eat and imitate what Daniel does in chapter 1 of his book. And you eat only vegetables and you drink water instead of your normal meals. My wife made an absolutely delicious vegetable soup for Catalyst this year. And I bet if you ask her, we can get her to share that recipe. If that might help you ease into the Daniel fast. And if you need another alternative, perhaps you're not ready for that full day, consider fasting for one meal each day. Fast for lunch and dedicate that time to prayer instead. Ultimately, the goal of all of this is growth and faithfulness, not perfection. And also I want to encourage us, it's hard to be hungry alone. I know I can get hangry when my stomach is gnawing itself, but somehow I think it makes it a little easier to know that I'm doing it with other people. So we've made a church center group that's just exists for us to be fasting together. So please join it. The QR code will lead you right into it. So let's just leave that up for a bit so people can join it. But this group will be something that we can use for sending each other messages, to send each other encouragements while we fast, and also a place for us to just pray for each other, and then to make plans let's break the fast together. Be like, hey, it's Wednesday night. Who wants to go grab sushi or tacos or whatever? Let's go get burgers. Let's break the fast together. So I encourage you to join that. You can use the QR code on the screen. And also, if you want to come back later, go into Church Center. If you go under the More tab, there's you can go into groups. And then under unique groups, there's fasting together. So I encourage you guys to find it, to join it. If you have trouble finding it, mark it in your response card later, and I'll send you the link directly. I just want to give people a chance to join it and encourage you to take part. And I want to invite us, because we can grow not only in our identities in Christ, but in our community and our relationships with one another as we enter into dry places together with intentionality this season of Lent. And now let us end with a final reminder and encouragement. First, I want to remind us, and I want us to remember, that desert time is not wasted time. Our God is not wasteful. This dry season, no matter how long and endless it may feel, no matter how barren and scarce it may appear, is a time for God to meet us, to shape us, and to form us. Desert time is not wasted time, but is intensely purposeful. And as for the encouragement, I have been in this desert, I've been in the Sonoran Desert since 2009, and God has taught me something miraculous about deserts in those years. A desert is a place of scarcity, where everything has learned to use its limited resources with great care and jealousy. Like Megan was saying, nothing wants to give us its water and everything wants to take ours. Just like time, nothing is wasted in the desert. Every resource is precious and scarce. It's all so necessary for survival. Deserts are a place where something like beauty, which is wholly unnecessary for survival, would feel like such a frivolous use of those limited resources. Beauty among scarcity surely feels like a waste, right? But all around us is such beauty. Our desert, we live in a desert that is full of colors, that's full of life and abundant beauty amongst scarcity. I want you guys to recognize that and appreciate this place God has placed us is so miraculous. The beauty of the desert is pure gift, and it is a reminder of God's goodness. In fact, I'm so moved by God's gift that I have a tattoo of our desert on my arm to point me back to the beauty of creation that God has given to us, that has placed me in, to remind me of that gift. Now, if you want to know, Tyler, why is it inside a whale? You'll have to ask me that later. But that is what I want to leave you with. When you find yourself in a dry place, wandering for what may feel like 40 years or 80 years or even more, when it may feel barren and desolate and empty and hopeless, it is not. With God, our dry places are both purposeful and beautiful. And with that, please pray with me. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for this space that we gather. I thank you for this desert place that we can sit and dwell in. Thank you for the abundant beauty all around us in this place of scarcity. And wherever we're at in our lives, whether we're in a dry season or not, a dry place or a place of milk and honey, as the promised land was so described, help us to remember you, to lean on you, to rely on you, to depend on you. As you form us, Lord, as you shape us, Lord, as you do that hard work, Lord, of softening our hearts and getting us to respond to you, Lord. That you are patient with us, that you let us take 40 years if that's what it takes, Lord. That you are there still, faithful to us, Lord, caring for us, providing manna, releasing water from rocks, Lord, as you did in the desert with the Israelites. Help us to be secure in our identity, Lord, as children of God, as your children that you care for. So as we walk through a dry place, Lord, as we dwell in the desert, Lord, I just give us to you, Lord, and I ask for us to remember you, to praise you in that. And all that, Lord, I give to you. In your holy name I pray. Amen.
Thank you for joining the Damascus Road podcast. Our mission is to follow Jesus together by being with God, loving everyone, transforming people, developing leaders, growing new ministries, and changing the world. You can find out more about us online at DamascusRoadTucson.com.